My name is Amir Barber. I'm a chemical engineer and a fitness nerd. And this is my little baby. This is my biceps masterclass, all right? So we're gonna be learning entirely too much about the biceps today. And the goal is, by the end of this video, none of the BSers online should be able to BS you. Okay, so we're going to be talking about their anatomy and function, common myths surrounding the biceps, how to actually train them and avoid injury while doing so. And at the end, just to make things easy, I'll give you the only 3 exercises you'll ever need to grow a massive set of guns. All right, so without further ado, let's jump right in. So this is where a cool little intro would go. I don't have that. I have something better. Boom. Anatomy. We're jumping right in. All right. So the biceps are made up of 2 muscles, hence the word bi. Okay. We have the biceps short head and the biceps long head. Now, where do they come from and where do they go? Try not to make a Cotton Eye Joe reference, but I did. There we go. Okay, so they both share the same insertion point on the radial tuberosity, which is a little notch in your radius, which is a forearm bone. So they attach to your forearm bone and they pull on that sucker, all right? And they originate from slightly different places on the shoulder blade. The long head actually comes up and it wraps around the top of your humerus, which is your upper arm bone. And then the short head just comes straight up, bypasses that, and attaches to the coracoid process of your scapula, of your shoulder blade. But they have very, very close origins. So let's go ahead and bust our first myth. All right, you've probably heard, oh, if you curl like this, then you'll grow your long head. You curl like this, you'll grow your short head, or something of that nature. And that's just false. We don't have a single shred of evidence to indicate that we can activate the long head more than the short head and vice versa. And we also have no studies showing outcomes that have one growing more than another, okay? So for all intents and purposes, these are either gonna grow together or they're gonna shrivel up into nothing together. So let's talk a little bit about their anatomical functions, what they actually do. All right, now the biceps are capable of helping out a little bit with shoulder flexion. So from like 0 to 45 degrees around there, they have a very small role. Okay, but the prime movers in that, who's doing all the heavy lifting in that motion, are your front deltoids and even a little bit of your upper chest. Okay, so the biceps are kind of just along for the ride. You're not gonna grow your biceps by doing this, okay? Because their primary function is elbow flexion, okay? So if we're gonna talk about elbow flexion, which is gonna be the way to grow your biceps, then we also have to mention all of these other muscles up here. Not all of them. There's basically 2 more that contribute to a significant degree, all right? Now, if we were to peel back the short head and the long head of the biceps, then we would see the brachialis. Okay, the brachialis attaches at your ulna, which is another forearm bone of yours, and it runs to your upper arm bone. Okay, so it pulls your ulna towards your upper arm bone. Okay, so it's a good elbow flexor. And the last one that I'll mention, and you can see hints of it right here and right here, is the brachioradialis. So this actually runs down your radius, like almost right below your wrist, and then it attaches to your humerus kind of at the start of it. So kind of around here somewhere, all right? And that again is another elbow flexor. So if we wanted to go about targeting any of these 3, technically 4 muscles, how would we go about doing that? And more importantly, what evidence is there to suggest that what we're doing is right? So let's build this process out from the ground up, okay? First things first, we have to understand what the brain is doing subconsciously, all right? If you're doing a curl, I don't care how many times you scream, brachioradialis, all right? It's not gonna make it any more or any less brachioradialis, right? Because your brain is gonna choose for you because it's smarter than you, okay? So we have to understand what the brain is doing subconsciously based on leverages and physics that it knows. And then we can choose an exercise to take advantage of what's going on subconsciously. So we're gonna build out this whole thing, but there's 2 concepts we need to talk about briefly first. The first thing we have to talk about is torque. And I know, Amir, leave the physics at home. I just want big biceps, okay? But to understand resistance training at a deeper level, you have to have an understanding of torque because muscle's main function is to manage torque at given joints. Okay, take that one with you, store it somewhere in your brain, and keep it for the rest of your life, okay? But torque is simply rotational force, all right? So it's talking about rotational force. And the equation for torque is equal to linear force, or just force, times moment arm. All right, so to illustrate this point, we're just gonna talk about a wrench. We all understand a wrench, right? So if I said, hey, you're a little weakling, you're only capable of pushing with, or pulling in this case, with 20 pounds of force, okay? Where are you gonna grab this from, here or here, to tighten this nut as best as you can? All right, if you've ever used a wrench, you're like, dude, I'm gonna grab it over here. Now, why does it work that way though? It's because the moment arm is much longer than this moment arm. Okay, so the torque is twice as much with the same force. You're pulling the same exact force, but it's twice as much over here compared to here, simply because this moment arm. So the longer the moment arm, the more torque you can create for the same exact force. Okay, so the second concept we have to talk about, and then we're off to the races, is how muscles actually pull. Okay, so we talked about earlier, we have these insertion points and these origin points. So the biceps attach to your radius right here, your forearm bone, and they attach somewhere up by your shoulder on your shoulder blade. Okay, and what the biceps do is simply pull these 2 points closer together. So you can imagine that this is the line of force from here. All right, and when it pulls, it rotates about this axis, your elbow joint. Okay, so if we extended out this line of force and we drew our little moment arm, we would see how much leverage the biceps have to pull in this specific situation, in this specific range of motion. And as you can imagine, it would change if your arm bone were down here, let's say. It would be a lot smaller, okay? Now we can talk about the brain. Okay, your brain can detect the internal moment arms of all of these different muscles. And based on which internal moment arm is the highest at a certain point in the range of motion, the brain will allocate more motor unit recruitment to that muscle. It will activate that muscle more, which is the ticket in the door to experience high levels of mechanical tension, which is the main driver for muscle growth. So in 1995, a team of researchers took it upon themselves to measure all of these internal moment arm lengths of all of the elbow flexors throughout the full range of motion. So I'm gonna explain this graph, okay? On the x-axis, we have the degrees of the joint angle. So 20 degrees is probably something like this, and 120 degrees is probably something like this. And my arms are indication for right about there and right about there. Okay, and these different lines represent the moment arm lengths of different muscles. So here we have the biceps, and then here is the brachioradialis. So I'm just gonna call this the BRD, because that's a lot of letters, okay? But let's observe some trends really quick, all right? The one to pay most attention to is that from 20 to 70 degrees, the biceps are on top relative to the other muscles involved, okay? So what the brain is gonna do with that, it's gonna say, hey, biceps have the most leverage to pull, I guess you're getting recruited, buddy, and it will maximally recruit the bicep relative to the other muscles. All right, and there's this weird inflection point, not necessarily an inflection point, but at this point, at around 70 degrees, the brachioradialis actually starts coming out on top. So as you can see, the brachioradialis relative to the biceps has more leverage. So once we get past 70 degrees, our brain's like, you know what? This brachioradialis thing, this is really good at pulling. I'm gonna use him as much as I can. Of course, you're still gonna be using the biceps. You're still gonna be using the brachialis. But in terms of maximum level of recruitment, we are looking at the brachioradialis. And I want to relate this back to reality, okay? So I'm gonna zoom in up here and we're gonna take a look at these moment arms. So this is at about a little past 90 degrees, right? So we're looking right here, okay? And these little black lines are the moment arms, okay? So this is the brachioradialis, and then I'm gonna change colors. This is its moment arm, which is the longest of the black lines, okay? I'm gonna erase it so you could see. And then the other two are relatively shorter, and the brachialis is much shorter than the biceps, which is much shorter than the brachioradialis, which this trend checks out right here. Okay, so there's one more thing to discuss that can affect the internal moment arm lengths, and that would be supination versus pronation, which is right here. So supination would be palm facing up. Pronation would be palm facing down. Now, you guys can probably see something happen with my bicep when I go from pronation to supination. So this graph is entirely about the biceps, and all we're doing is comparing supination to neutral grip to pronation and looking at those internal moment arm lengths changes in the biceps. All right, and there's a clear trend here. So this top line is supinated, palm up. This middle line is a neutral grip, and this bottom line, at least for most of the range of motion, is a pronated grip. So supinated has the biceps having the most leverage. As we go to neutral, it drops a little bit, and as we go to pronated, it drops off a little bit more. But it kind of makes a comeback somewhere around 90 degrees, but for all intents and purposes, more biceps, less biceps. So what are the main takeaways here? So if we want to target the biceps, we should use a supinated grip and choose an exercise that has peak forces occurring from about 20 to 70 degrees of elbow flexion. If we want to target the brachioradialis, this nice chunk of forearm meat that also helps push up against the biceps, then we should be using a pronated grip with an exercise that has peak forces occurring after or at 70 degrees of elbow flexion. In this part, we'll be talking about actual training. Now, in the last part, we discussed theory and anatomy, and we described what exercises should be and their loading patterns. In this part, we're gonna talk about actual training tips and the 3 exercises that I think will fully train the whole elbow flexor complex. Okay, so when we're discussing actual exercise selection, there's 3 main things that I'll be talking about. The first is alignment. Wow, I wish that actually marked it. The second would be stability, and the third is gonna be the resistance profile. Okay, so the first thing we're gonna start with is alignment. So the first tip I have when it comes to alignment is keep your upper arm fixed in place. Now on the left here is a video of me doing a biceps curl pretty well. You can see that my upper arm stays pretty much straight down by my side. It's not going up and down. Over here, you can see me lifting my arm. Okay, so my arm went from here to here, right? And what we're doing is we're getting the front delt involved in that movement, and we're shifting tension off of the biceps. We can start nerding out and drawing resistance and profiles and torque and stuff, but what you need to know is that there's less tension on the bicep now, and we shifted a lot of the focus to the front delt, which isn't what we're trying to do. So do not swing around your upper arm. Tip number 2 when it comes to alignment, if you take anything away from these videos, please let this section be it. All right, so you'll notice I'm curling straight up in the first one, and I have an internal on the second one, and on the third one, I go here. Okay, so I'll let that one play out for a sec, but I just want to talk about the scenarios in which this might happen. So in this first case, we really like this, right? We have really good alignment between the line of force and our elbow joint. So what happens in this second one when we're kind of fixed in place here, when we're internally rotated a little bit, and this can happen, let's say you grab an easy bar a little bit too narrow when you curl up and you come here, we actually have a force that's yanking on our elbow this way. And similarly, if we grab a barbell and let's say we go a little bit wider than shoulder width apart, let's say we go here and we come up, then we have a force yanking our elbow this way. Now to explain why that is such a terrible idea, I have my little tripod here, okay? So let's pretend this is your elbow joint. It's a hinge joint. This is the only way it wants to bend, similar to your knee. So when you do any of this or any of this, right, there's a force pushing on it this way. this poor thing is gonna break if I keep doing this and pushing on it this way, right? So imagine week after week you're going into the gym doing this to your elbows. Yeah, they probably won't explode the first time you do it, but over time, you're looking at maybe some long-term health issues and joint issues if you don't have good alignment here, okay? And I'll talk more about it as we're about to jump straight into the exercises that I recommend. Quite possibly the GOAT of biceps exercises, in my opinion, is the single arm dumbbell preacher curl. And for a few different reasons, okay? First of all, it has great alignment, and that kind of goes for anything that's single arm. Because like we talked about, if you're a big guy and you can't really keep your upper arm parallel to the ground, both of them at the same time, then if you go single arm, you can kind of lean into it. All right, so it has great alignment and allows for great alignment as you lean over on that preacher curl. Okay, so that's great. Second is the resistance profile. So let me see if I can get this perfect. This is where there's peak resistance. Okay, so here's the line of force from the dumbbell. That's not straight down. Let me try that again. Sheesh. Okay, there we go. That's straight down. And the moment arm is the longest it's gonna be right here. Now we're talking about external torque, but what you need to know is that this is where there's the most resistance, okay? Now, if we were to figure out what degree of elbow flexion this is, I would venture to say, so this would be 90, right? This is about halfway between 90, so it's 45 degrees. Now, if you remember what we talked about in that last part, we said for the biceps, we want to choose an exercise that has a peak resistance somewhere between 20 and 70 degrees. Okay, what's exactly halfway between 20 and 70? Bada bing, bada boom. Veritable GOAT. Okay, so that's another reason I absolutely love it. And lastly, it's very stable, okay? So when you jam your arm into that pad, you don't have to manage any torque about the shoulder joint or anything. It's just all biceps. And the more stable a movement is, generally, the more output you can get from the target musculature. So it's just awesome. And one thing I can mention that goes down the nerd rabbit hole is something called the bilateral force deficit. Okay, so when you're doing both sides at a time, you actually get a little bit weaker because your brain has to send a central motor command to both of those sides. If you just instead focus on one side, you can eke out just a couple more reps. So really doing one side at a time, assuming you take adequate rest periods in between, can help stimulate muscle growth even more. Now you may be like, Amir, why don't we just train everything one side at a time? It's simply a matter of efficiency, to be completely honest. It would take forever to do your left arm, then do your right arm. You have to rest between them to get the benefit out of that. Okay, but enough on this movement, just go do it. It's freaking awesome, okay? Next up will be there's a whole video and I will link this tutorial video in the description so you guys can figure that out. Next up is the alternating dumbbell biceps curl, okay? Now, man, I don't know why I have extremely stable here. It's sort of stable. It's not unstable, okay? But the alternating biceps curl, right, where we kind of lean back and forth and do one arm at a time, allows for great alignment. So you're gonna see in a second here, hopefully, that I can kind of lean towards this side to get my upper arm parallel to the ground. And then I lean towards the other side and do the same thing. So again, it's great alignment, no ouchies on the elbows. And the resistance of this movement peaks out at about 90 degrees of elbow flexion. So what does that mean? It means that we are training the biceps arguably where they can produce the most overall torque, all right? But we're getting a really healthy mix of biceps and brachioradialis stimulus, okay? So it's a really good mix of both. And if we do a single arm dumbbell preacher curl, I'd say we want to prioritize that movement. And this would be another movement to add in, right? So the preacher curl would train us through the lengthened to the mid range. And this would train us through the mid to shortened range for the biceps. And it would also be a great stimulus to the brachioradialis. So I really do love this movement. And also there's something to be said about how easy it is to set up. You grab two dumbbells, you stand there, you do the thing. I'm all for elaborate setups when it actually makes a big difference, but I think there's not really a reason to get too fancy with this particular movement pattern. Okay, so I am partial to the alternating dumbbell biceps curls. Okay, last but not least, and again, I'll link this video down below. There's me dancing. One more thing to say. Whenever you're training biceps, let all of the movement just come from the elbow joint. If you start doing this whole number like I'm doing in this video, right? Let's dance, all right? Yeah, what are we doing? We're using momentum to try training our biceps. Exercises 3 and 4, or more like 3 and 3.5, pronated-ish curls. So these both are gonna have peak resistance at 90 degrees or more of elbow flexion. And these are gonna bias the brachioradialis, this nice hunk of forearm muscle right here and right here. I'm gonna put this down for a sec and explain why I said pronated-ish. All right, so if you're fully pronated, you end up running into this issue where your upper arm, like we talked about, is no longer parallel to the ground. Right? And a lot of people will have wrist issues with that, structural issues, but just put your upper arm down by your side, go into neutral grip, and try going fully pronated without seeing that upper arm move at all. Extremely hard. So what I think we can do is settle for as much pronation as we can get, maybe about right there, without getting that elbow flare that we talked about. So while being able to keep your upper arm perpendicular to the ground. Okay, so that's why I said pronated-ish. All right? So in both of these movements, right, let me clear them off so you can see them nice. You'll see I have a slight hinge forward here, okay? And what that hinge forward does is it allows me to get my arms a little bit more out in front of my body so I don't have my lats in the way, all right? And it also changes the resistance profile slightly to make peak resistance occur at a little bit past 90 degrees. So it's really a pure brachioradialis movement. Okay, now one thing I wanted to say, none of these are must-do exercises. There are similar alternatives that can achieve the same thing. But I think if you take these 3 and progressively overload them over time and have them be a part of your routine, they all do something a little bit different. They are not redundant, and your biceps will really like it, as well as your brachioradialis and your brachialis, okay? So if you guys have any questions, drop them down below in the comments. I hope you feel like you learned something about the biceps and that you're ready to get those guns you've always wanted. But until next time, much love, and please share it with a friend. All right, peace.